Okay, we're going to learn now a rather easy Gemara. It goes from Ikad Amri, and we'll get to Ibaylahu. And just to clarify what we're doing here, we'll go back one page, and on the bottom of this page, we quoted the Mishnah that says when the craftsman returns the object, or he tells the owner, come take your object and bring me the money, instead of being a Shemer Sachar, which he was the whole time he was working on it, he becomes a Shemer Chinam, which means he's not responsible if it gets lost or stolen. And that was the quote from our Mishnah. However, we compared that to a borrower who was returning an object. A borrower is called a shoyel. He's returning the object, and if it's after the time of borrowing, you see over here, if it's after the time of borrowing, then he's pater. He does not remain in the same status as a borrower. Okay, so far everything seems to add up. The worker is not in the same status. He started off as a Shemer Sachar, the craftsman, and then he becomes a Shemer Chinam when he's finished. And the borrower also becomes he stops being a borrower and he goes down a level. I'm not going to say exactly which level he goes down to, but he goes down a level. So, however, we asked the question on that this is only if he says by the craftsman, if the craftsman says take it. But let's say he just says I'm finished, then maybe he would stay in the same status. Now it would be a contradiction to the case of the borrower. The borrower is sending it back, and over there he doesn't have the same status. And by the craftsman, he remains in the same status if he says that he's finished. So for that we answered that actually that's a wrong assumption, and if he says he's finished, he loses that status. He becomes a Shemer Chinam, just like the borrower who is returning it also becomes a Shemer Chinam. Okay, great. Ikad Amri. Some say a different version of this comparison between the borrower, the shoyel, and the uman, the craftsman. Amar Rav Nachman bar Papa. Rav Nachman bar Papa says, Af anan nami tanina. Af anan. We also. Nami also tanina learned it in a Mishnah. What is he referring to? We also learned this in a Mishnah. He's referring to the case of the borrower. We just quoted the case of the borrower that's returning the object, and he loses the status of a borrower if the work is over. So it goes like this. We also learned this in a Mishnah. Which Mishnah does he quote? Hey, none other than ours. V'kulan sha'amru, and all that say, which means any worker, any craftsman that says, Tola shalach, take what is yours, v'havi mais, and bring the money, Shemer Chinam, is considered a Shemer Chinam. And so very good. He loses the status that he had originally. Originally was a Shemer Sachar. The same thing as with the borrower. Also loses the status. He's not a shoyel anymore. He's not a borrower. Goes down. Everything's great. And my love means is it not? Huadin gamartiv. The same thing would apply if he says I have finished my work. In other words, the craftsman, whether he says take it and bring the money later, or he says I'm finished, he becomes a Shemer Chinam. So the same thing with a shoyel. As soon as he's finished and the time is up, the halacha is that he's not a shoyel anymore. And it's the Mishnah here and the Mishnah there are symmetrical. They fit perfectly together. They're in line. So the Gemara says loy. They actually not saying the same thing because Tola Shalach Shaini. In our Mishnah, it's specifically saying when the craftsman says, take your thing, I do not want it anymore. That's when he becomes a Shemer Chinam. However, if he says Gamartiv, I have completed it, then maybe he remains a Shemer Sachar, and therefore they're not saying the same thing. Now, our Gemara, this is where our Gemara ends. However, the Gemara is not saying that it's actually the halacha is that Gamartiv remains a Shemer Sachar. It's just saying that you have no proof that Gamartiv is the same as Tola Shalach. In other words, there may be a difference between if he says I have finished the work to if he says take what is yours and bring the money. Okay. Huna bar Mereimar kamei de Ravina. Huna Mar bar Remeimar. I guess his name is Huna Mar, and he's the son of Mereimar. Was in front of Ravina, and Rami Masnisana Adadi. He asked a contradiction between the Mishnayos that we just said. Rami means a contradiction. Rami Masnisin Ahadadi means against each other. He contradicted the Mishnahs against each other. Umeshani, and he also answered them. What was the contradiction? It says, Tanan, in our Mishnah we learned, Vikulan Shamru, all that have said, which means all workers, all craftsmen, that have finished the work and they say, Tala Shalach, take your object, Vahavi Mais, and bring the money, Shem Rechinam, they become an unpaid watchman, which means that they're only responsible for negligence, but they're not responsible if it's lost or stolen. And the same thing would apply, this is an assumption, the same thing would apply if he says, I have completed the work, he is only responsible for negligence, but not responsible if it's lost and stolen. In other words, he's only a Shem Rechinam. Biraminu, I'll ask you a stira, this is Hunamar Barameimar asking, Amalai Shayel, if the borrower says, Shlach, send me the cow, he wants to borrow it, he tells the owner, the lender, send it to me. Vishalcha, the owner sent it, Mesa, and it died, Chayav. So the borrower is responsible for it. And the same thing applies at the time of returning. So here we see that he's chayav when it's being returned. However, in the case of the worker, the craftsman, he's pater when it's being returned. Okay, so Umeshani, now the answer to that contradiction is Amar Rav Bar Papa, Amar Rav Chisda. Rav Bar Papa says in the name of Rav Chisda, Lo Shanu, when did we learn that he's chayiv when it's being returned? That's when it's being returned during the days of borrowing. Abalachi Meshilasa, but if it's after the time of borrowing, then he's going to be pater. So in other words, he when he asked the Brisa, he left out the explanation given by Rav Bar Papa that this. When he asked the contradiction on the Mishnayos, when he asked the contradiction on the Mishnayos, he left out the explanation of Rav Bar Papa that says that the Mishnah of the borrower is only referring to when it's during the time of borrowing, that's when he's going to be chayav. However, after the time of borrowing, he's going to be pater. He left that out. So we thought that he's always going to be chayav no matter what. And then we compared that to the worker, the craftsman, that becomes pater when he returns it. So when you match them up, the craftsman's pater, the borrower is chayav, so it's contradiction. So we answer that actually in the case of the borrower, he also would be pater if it's after the time of borrowing. Okay.